There are moments in life that divide everything into before and after moments that mark you so deeply that you're never the same person again. For me, that moment happened on a cold November afternoon when the sky was heavy with gray clouds and the icy wind bit my face I walked the trail around the lake near my home. I was there simply trying to forget yet another horrible argument with my daughter-in-law. Jennifer, yet another humiliation I'd swallowed silently because I still believed maintaining family peace was more important than my own dignity. How wrong I was. How blind I was to everything happening around me. But that afternoon, walking alone in that place, I knew so well something happened that changed everything. Something that finally made me open my eyes to the terrible truth I'd refused to see for years. It was almost dusk when I saw her. Jennifer was on the other side of the lake in a secluded area half hidden by trees, where almost no one usually goes because the terrain was uneven and full of loose rocks. She was alone, and it was already strange because Jennifer always said she hated that place, complained about how dirty it was, and that she didn't understand why anyone would want to walk there. But what really made me stop and pay attention was her manner. She was looking nervously around like someone doing something wrong and afraid of being caught. Her hands were shaking as she held something heavy, a large wooden box that seemed to be straining to carry. I stood there hidden behind a thick tree, watching, not quite understanding what was happening. And then in a quick, desperate movement, Jennifer lifted the box and threw it forcefully into the water. The sound of the impact echoed in the afternoon silence, and I watched the box sink quickly, disappearing into the dark waters of the lake. My heart raced. My mind tried to process what I had just seen. Why would Jennifer be doing this? Why would she be throwing a box into the lake with such urgency, such nervousness? Something inside me, some instinct I didn't even know, I had told me this wasn't normal, that something was very wrong. I watched as Jennifer wiped her hands on her dark jeans, looked around once more with that tense, worried expression, and then almost ran out of there toward the parking lot. I waited until she got in her car and drove away until I could no longer see her vehicle on the road. And only then did I emerge from my hiding place. I walked to the edge of the lake, staring at the exact spot where the box had sunk. The water was calm again, as if nothing had happened, but I knew something had happened. Something important. Something Jennifer was desperate to hide. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the water, trying to decide what to do. My mind was a blur full of unanswered questions. What was in that box? Why was Jennifer so upset? Why did she have to dispose of it so dramatically, throwing it in the lake instead of simply throwing it in the trash like any normal person would? And most importantly, why did it leave me with such a sinking feeling, as if I knew somehow that what was in that box had something to do with me? I sat on a nearby wooden bench, watching the lake as the sky grew darker. Other hikers passed me occasionally, a few people with puppies, an elderly couple, but no one paid me any attention. I was just another lady sitting on a bench enjoying the afternoon. No one could have imagined the whirlwind of thoughts racing through my head at that moment. When I looked at my watch, it was almost 6:30 in the afternoon. Most people had already left, and I was practically alone there. That's when I made the decision. I needed to know what was in that box. I don't know if it was curiosity, intuition, or simply the fact that I was tired of always being the one left out, the last to know, but something compelled me to act. I got up from the bench, looked around to make sure no one was watching, took off my shoes and socks rolled up, my pants to my knees, and stepped into the icy lake water. The cold was intense, cutting to the bone, but I was so focused on what I needed to do that I barely felt the discomfort. The water was murky, making it impossible to see the bottom, so I had to use my feet to feel around, feeling for rocks, mud, twigs. I spent several minutes moving slowly, exploring the area where I had seen the box sink. And then finally, my foot touched something solid, rectangular. It was the box. I plunged my hands into the cold water, trying to pick up the box, but it was heavier than I'd imagined. I had to try several times, using all my strength, until I finally managed to drag it to the shore. When I finally placed the box on the grass, I had to sit for a moment, completely out of breath, my hands shaking from both the cold and the adrenaline. The box was dark wood, somewhat old, the kind people use to store tools or old documents. It had a simple padlock, nothing too fancy, but it still prevented me from opening it. I looked around for something I could use and found a large, heavy rock a few feet away. I went back to the box, placed the rock on top of the padlock, and struck it hard. 3 blows were enough to break the metal, and the padlock fell to the ground with a metallic clang. I took a deep breath. My hands were shaking as I gripped the lid of the box. Part of me didn't want to open it, afraid of what I might find inside. But it was too late to turn back now. I slowly opened the lid, and what I saw inside literally made me fall to my knees in the wet grass. Inside the box were envelopes, dozens and dozens of white envelopes, all addressed to me and my mother's. Unmistakable handwriting. Letters. Letters I had never received. Letters someone had intercepted and hidden from me. My hands shook even more as I picked up the envelopes one by one, seeing my name written on them, seeing the postmarks, realizing these letters had been sent during the last months of my mother's life 5 years ago. 5 years I had lived without knowing these letters existed. 5 years someone had hidden them from me. But the letters weren't all. Inside the box were also photos, many old photos, some I recognized and others I'd never seen. Photos of my mother when she was young, photos of me as a child, photos of important moments in my life that I thought were lost forever. And beneath all of this, at the bottom of the box, were documents. Official papers, notarial documents, bank statements, all wet but still legible. I began to read the documents, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold them, and with each line I read each number. I saw each revelation that unfolded before my eyes, my heart sank deeper and deeper. Because what was there in those wet and stained papers was proof of a betrayal so great, so absurd that I simply couldn't process it. Proof that I had been robbed. That my own family had robbed me in such a cruel and calculated way. That to this day I wonder how I managed to remain unaware of it all these years. If you've made it this far, you probably understand that families can keep terrible secrets, right? This channel is a safe space, where real stories like mine are shared without judgment, where people like you and me can find comfort in knowing we're not alone in our pain and struggles. Subscribe to the channel and be part of this community of hearts that understand each other, support each other, and together transform difficult experiences into life lessons. Because what I discovered in that box was just the beginning of a long and painful journey, but one that taught me more about strength, courage, and dignity than I've learned in my entire life. Now, let me tell this whole story from the beginning. Because to understand the full extent of what happened, you need to know who I was before that day at the lake. My name is Margaret Patterson. I'm 62 years old, and I was born and raised in a small town in rural Minnesota called Willow Creek. I had a simple but happy childhood, the only child of hardworking parents who taught me the value of honesty, hard work, and family. My father worked for 40 years in a paper mill, and my mother was a seamstress making custom clothes for the women of the town. They were never wealthy, but we always had enough, and most importantly, we had love, unity, and mutual respect. It was with these values that I grew up, and it was with these same values that I tried to raise my son Michael when he was born. I met my husband Robert when I was 22. He was 3 years older than me, worked as a supervisor at a construction company, and was the kindest, most honest man I had ever known. We married after 2 years of dating in a simple ceremony at our local church, and were happy for 34 years until the day he suffered a massive heart attack and died almost instantly at the age of 59. It was 8 years ago, and to this day, I miss him every day. Robert was my rock, my best friend, my companion through everything. If he had been alive when all this happened, I'm sure things would have been different. He would never have allowed our son to do what he did. He would have protected me and my mother's memory. Michael was born when I was 26. It was a smooth pregnancy and an uncomplicated birth. He was a calm baby and grew up to be a sweet and loving boy. He was always a good son, studious, respectful, and affectionate. He never gave me any major problems as a teenager, as so many parents do. He graduated from high school with excellent grades, received a partial scholarship to study business at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, and it was there that he met Jennifer. Clark, she was a sophomore when he entered as a freshman coming from a wealthy Chicago family. Her father was some kind of high-ranking executive at a tech company. From the first day Michael told me about her, I knew he was completely smitten. He described Jennifer as the most wonderful thing ever, talking about how beautiful, intelligent, and sophisticated she was. When I finally met Jennifer a few months after they started dating, I confess I was a bit surprised. It wasn't that she wasn't beautiful and intelligent as Michael had described. But there was something about her, something in the way she looked at me, at our home, at our simple life that bothered me. It was as if she were constantly evaluating everything and finding it inferior to what she was used to. I remember that at that first dinner at our house, she made several comments that were meant as compliments, but were actually veiled criticisms. She said she found it charming that we still had solid wood furniture instead of the modern ones everyone was buying. She said it was interesting that I cooked my own food instead of buying ready-made meals. She said it must be relaxing living in a small town where there wasn't much to do. Each comment was a small dig, but said in such a way that if I complained, I would seem overly sensitive. Robert at that time noticed it too. After Jennifer and Michael left that day, he commented to me that she seemed a little stuck up, a little cocky, but that he hoped it was just nerves from meeting her boyfriend's family for the first time. I wanted to believe it too. I wanted to believe that over time, Jennifer would loosen up, become more genuine, more human. But that wasn't what happened. As the months and years passed, Jennifer only got worse. She had a way of making you feel small without saying anything explicitly offensive. She had a way of excluding you and making you seem like you were being overly sensitive. And worst of all, Michael didn't see any of this. Or if he did, he chose to ignore it. He was so in love, so enchanted by her that he simply couldn't or wouldn't see how she treated the people around her, especially me. They dated for 3 years while finishing college. Michael graduated and got a good job at a marketing firm in Minneapolis. Jennifer graduated a year after him in public relations and also stayed in Minneapolis working at an advertising agency. They married when Michael was 25 and she was 23. The wedding was a huge and expensive celebration in Jennifer's hometown of Chicago. It was a full weekend of events, a rehearsal dinner, an elaborate ceremony in a historic church, and a reception at a 5-star hotel with over 200 guests. Jennifer's parents paid for everything and made that very clear. Throughout the weekend, I felt like an outsider, as if I didn't belong in that world of luxury and ostentation. Jennifer's friends and family barely spoke to me, and when they did, it was only out of politeness. I was clearly the small-town mother, the elementary school teacher with my simple clothes and modest manners completely out of place in sophistication. Robert held my hand during the ceremony and whispered that everything would be okay. That the important thing was that our son was happy. But I could see the worry in his eyes too. We both knew somehow that this wedding would change. Michael would take him away from us. And we were right. After the wedding, Michael's visits became increasingly rare. He and Jennifer lived in Minneapolis, about 3 hours away from Willow Creek, but they only came to visit us maybe 3 or 4 times a year. And when they did, Jennifer always found something to complain about. She complained about the heat, the cold, the food, the lack of entertainment options in the city. She complained that the bed in the guest room was uncomfortable, that the breakfast didn't have the things she liked, that there wasn't a good internet connection in our house. It was exhausting trying to please someone who clearly didn't want to be pleased. Things got even worse after Robert died. Without my husband to support and defend me, I was completely vulnerable. Michael came to the funeral, of course, but only stayed for 2 days and then flew back to Minneapolis, saying he had important work commitments he couldn't postpone. Jennifer didn't even attend the funeral, texting that she had a bad flu and that the doctor had recommended bed rest. I was left alone to deal with the entire grieving process, all the post-funeral arrangements, and all the probate and paperwork. My mother, who was 78 at the time, came to stay with me for a few weeks, and she was the one who truly supported me during that terrible time. My mother, Dorothy, was always an incredible woman. Strong, independent, and hardworking. After my father died 20 years ago, she continued living alone in the house, where she had raised her family, continuing to work as a seamstress until she was 70. She received a small pension from my father and the rent from her sewing business and lived very modestly, but she always seemed happy that way. She was a woman who didn't need much to be happy, who found joy in the simple things in life. And she loved me deeply. I always knew that. After Robert's death, my mother began visiting me more often, spending weekends with me, helping me with the housework, keeping me company. It was a difficult time, but having my mother by my side made it more bearable. About a year after Robert's death, my mother began experiencing some strange symptoms: extreme fatigue, loss of appetite, abdominal pain. After several tests, the devastating diagnosis came: advanced stage pancreatic cancer. The doctors said she had only a few months to live. That there was little they could do beyond palliative treatments to manage the pain. It was a huge shock. My mother had just turned 80, but she had always been so active, so strong, that it was difficult to accept that she was dying. I spent the last months of her life caring for her, taking her to doctor's appointments, keeping her company, trying to make her final days as comfortable as possible. During this time, Michael visited his grandmother. Few times, but the visits were always short, and he seemed uncomfortable with the situation. Jennifer never came, always having some excuse. My mother never complained about it. She was always someone who didn't like to create conflict, but I could see the sadness in her eyes when Michael left after just a few hours, or when she asked about her daughter-in-law, and I had to make up some excuse to explain why Jennifer never showed up. One day, about 2 weeks before she died, my mother called me in for a serious talk. She said she had organized all her important documents, that she had updated her will, and that she had left everything ready so that I wouldn't have any complications after she was gone. She said she had saved money all her life, living simply and putting away as much as she could because she wanted to make sure I would be well taken care of financially. She said Robert had been a good provider, but that she knew the pension he had left wasn't much, and that she wanted to supplement it to ensure I had a comfortable old age. I hugged my mother and cried, telling her that I didn't care about money, that all I wanted was for her to be well, for her to recover. But we both knew there was no recovery. My mother died peacefully on a Tuesday afternoon in June, sleeping in her bed in the nursing home, where she was staying for the last few days. I was holding her hand when she took her last breath. It was one of the most painful experiences of my life, losing my mother. She was my best friend, my confidant, my source of strength. Without Robert and without her, I felt completely alone in the world. Well, I still had Michael, my son, but he seemed increasingly distant, increasingly absorbed in his life in Minneapolis with Jennifer. After my mother's funeral, Michael offered to handle all her affairs. He said I was too emotionally distraught to deal with paperwork and legal matters, and that it would be easier if he handled everything. He was the only grandchild, had power of attorney that my mother had given him a few months before she died, and he seemed genuinely willing to help. I accepted, grateful to have such a caring son, so willing to take on these responsibilities to spare his mother further suffering. What an idiot I was! How blind I was! Michael took care of emptying my mother's house, selling the furniture, and organizing her belongings. He said most of the things were worthless and had donated them to charity. He said the old photos had been lost during the move, that he was very sorry, but that some boxes had gotten wet and the contents had been damaged. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He was my son, the person I loved most in the world after Robert and my mother died. A few months after my mother's death, Michael came to visit me and handed me an envelope with $5,000 in cash. He said it was the inheritance Grandma had left, that she had a small savings account, and that this was the total amount. I accepted the money and thanked him, touched that my mother had managed to save that for me, even by living so simply. $5,000. That was the amount my son said my mother had left. A paltry $5,000 from a woman who had lived to be 80, who had worked hard all her life, who had always been extremely frugal. But I didn't question it. It never occurred to me that my mother could have left more than that. After all, she had always lived modestly, never shown herself to have much money, always been careful with her spending. $5,000 seemed reasonable for someone like her. How wrong I was. How deceived I had been. Life went on. I tried to adapt to my new reality as a motherless widow living alone in my house in Willow Creek, filling my time with reading, gardening, and volunteering at the local library. Michael occasionally came to visit me maybe twice a year. The conversations were superficial. He talked about work, about life in Minneapolis, but never about anything truly personal or deep. And then 5 years ago, he broke the news to me that Jennifer was pregnant. She was going to be a grandmother. I remember crying with joy when he told me. I would finally have a grandchild, someone to love, someone to make memories with, someone who might make me feel less alone. Tyler was born one day in March, a beautiful, healthy baby. When I went to the hospital to meet him, my heart swelled with love. It was a feeling I hadn't felt in a long time, that unconditional love that desired to protect and care. Jennifer was in the hospital room, all dressed up and made up. Even though she'd just given birth, receiving visits from her friends and family. She greeted me politely but coolly, letting me hold the baby for only a few minutes before asking for it back, 'cause he was getting fussy. It hurt, but I swallowed it and forced a smile. He was her grandson, after all. I had no right to complain. In the months following Tyler's birth, Jennifer began calling me frequently, asking for help. She needed a last-minute babysitter. Could she come to Minneapolis to care for Tyler? She was overwhelmed and needed a few hours of rest. Could I spend the weekend there helping? I always said yes. I always dropped everything to help because he was my grandson, because I wanted to be present in his life, because I thought that by helping Jennifer, I was building a better relationship with her. How foolish I was. Jennifer wasn't trying to build a relationship at all. She was just using me, taking advantage of a foolish mother-in-law desperate for affection and attention. During Tyler's first 2 years of life, I made countless trips to Minneapolis. She stayed there caring for him while Jennifer went out with friends, went to the salon, and shopped. I changed diapers, gave bottles, and woke up in the middle of the night when he cried. She did everything a mother does, but received no recognition for it. For Jennifer, it was my duty as a grandmother. When Tyler turned 2, they moved from Minneapolis to a smaller town called Adena, a much more expensive and upscale area. They bought a large 4-bedroom house with a pool and a huge yard. Jennifer stopped working to dedicate herself entirely to being a mother and stay-at-home mom, or so she claimed. In reality, she had a nanny who stayed with Tyler most of the time, while she went to the gym, had lunch with friends, and participated in book clubs and social groups. The visits continued, but now Jennifer had more demands. She wanted me to help around the house, not just with Tyler. Could I do some laundry? While I was there, could I prepare some meals and freeze them? Could I organize Tyler's messy playroom? I did it all without complaint, happy to be helpful, happy to have an excuse to spend time with my grandson. But the truth was, I was being exploited, used as a free maid. And then the requests for money began. At first, they were small and subtle. Jennifer would mention that she'd seen a beautiful set of furniture for Tyler's room, but it was a little over their budget that month. I'd offer to help, of course. They were my only children and grandchild. I wanted to help. I paid for the furniture, happy to contribute. Then it was a special stroller Tyler needed because his old one was no longer age-appropriate. Then it was an imported playpen, a better car seat designer, clothes. Each request seemed reasonable in isolation, but when I look back, I realize that over the course of 3 years, I spent tens of thousands of dollars buying things for Tyler, for Michael and Jennifer's home, always, with the excuse that I was helping my family. The worst happened 2 years ago when Jennifer said they needed to renovate the house because it had some structural issues that needed urgent repair. She said she was afraid something would happen to Tyler if they didn't make the repairs soon. She asked if I could lend her $15,000 to cover the renovation costs. While they waited for a bonus Michael was getting at work. Lend it, she said. It would be temporary, they'd pay it back in a few months. I used a good portion of my savings to give them that money. Needless to say, I never saw that money back. When I asked about it a few months later, Jennifer was offended, saying I was charging her like a stranger, that family helps family without expecting anything in return. I felt guilty for even asking and never brought it up again. Besides the money, there was the way Jennifer treated me. She had a way of making me feel small, inadequate, unwanted. When I suggested something about Tyler's upbringing, she always had a reason why my suggestion was wrong or outdated. When I offered to make something special for Tyler, like the birthday cake, she always already had other plans that didn't include me. When I tried to participate in decisions about Tyler, she reminded me that I was just the grandmother, that the decisions were the parents'. I was good enough to babysit for free, to give money to do housework, but not to have a say in my grandson's life. Through it all, Michael simply watched, doing nothing. At first, I tried to talk to him about how Jennifer treated me, but he always defended his wife. He said I was being overly sensitive, that Jennifer didn't mean to hurt me, that it was just her way. He told me I needed to understand that they had their own way of doing things and that I needed to respect that. Gradually, I stopped complaining. I saw it was pointless, that Michael had chosen his side, not mine. This hurt more than anything Jennifer could do or say. My son had become a stranger, someone I no longer recognized. On the morning of that fateful day in November, I'd had another argument with Jennifer. It was about Tyler's 5th birthday party the following week. I'd called to ask if I could make the cake, my signature cake, a chocolate cake with cream cheese frosting and brigadeiro filling my family always loved. But Jennifer coldly told me she'd already ordered a cake from a famous and expensive bakery and that my help wasn't needed. She said it would be a cake with a specific theme that I couldn't replicate. When I insisted, saying I'd like to at least contribute something to the party, she said I could help by serving drinks to the guests during the party. Serving drinks? As if I were a hired waitress. I hung up the phone with a heavy heart, feeling humiliated once again. That's why I went for a walk around the lake that afternoon. I needed to clear my mind, process my feelings, maybe even finally accept that my place in that family was marginal, that I would always be the unwanted mother-in-law. And grandmother they tolerated out of obligation. I never imagined that that walk would change everything. I never imagined that by watching Jennifer throw that box into the lake, I was about to discover a truth that would make all my previous pain seem insignificant in comparison. After retrieving the box from the lake that afternoon, after looking at the letters, the photos, the documents, I sat there on the shore as the sky darkened completely. My mind was in absolute shock. The documents I found showed that my mother hadn't left just $5,000 as Michael had claimed. She had left a much, much larger amount. There were statements from a bank account in my name with a balance of $250,000. There was also the deed to a small cottage in Wisconsin that my mother apparently owned and that I hadn't known existed. There were documents showing that this house had been sold 6 months after my mother's death for $180,000. All this money, all this property was legally mine, but I had never received anything beyond that $5,000. My mother's letters were even more painful to read. In them, she wrote of her love for me, of the precious memories we had shared, of her pride in me. In one letter, dated just 3 weeks before her death, she wrote specifically about the money she was leaving me. She said she had worked hard her entire life, saved every penny she could, living extremely frugally, all to ensure her only daughter would be financially secure. She said I deserved a comfortable old age free from financial worries, and that it was her final gift to me. A way of thanking me for all the love and care I had always shown her. She also said she had entrusted everything to Michael because she believed he would deliver it to me in the right way at the right time. But Michael hadn't given anything away. He'd kept everything. Or rather, he and Jennifer had kept everything. And not only that, they'd hidden my mother's letters, hidden the photos, destroyed the memories she wanted me to have. And now, 5 years later, Jennifer was trying to destroy the evidence by throwing it all into the lake. Why? What had happened that made her so desperate to get rid of that box? Now, I took the box home that night, carefully put everything away, and separated the documents to dry. I didn't sleep at all, spending the entire night reading and rereading my mother's letters. Crying, feeling a mixture of pain, anger, and betrayal I had never experienced before. How could my son do this? How could he look into my eyes for 5 years, watch me struggle financially, watch me give up things to give money to him, and Jennifer and never say a word about the inheritance he had stolen from me the next morning. I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I knew exactly what I needed to do. I called a lawyer, Mr. Daniel Morrison, who had been the father of one of my students many years ago and was now a respected attorney in the region. I scheduled an urgent appointment for that same afternoon. When I arrived at his office carrying with me all the documents I'd found in the box, Daniel was visibly shocked to hear my story. He examined each document with meticulous attention, taking notes, making copies, and asking detailed questions. After nearly 2 hours of analysis, Daniel leaned back in his chair and broke the news to me. What Michael and Jennifer had done was clearly illegal. Embezzlement at the very least. Possibly document forgery if they had forged any signatures or authorizations. Inheritance fraud. He said I had a very strong case that the documents I had were sufficient evidence to not only recover my money through civil action, but also to open a criminal case against them. But he also warned me of the consequences. A lawsuit like this would be long, expensive, and emotionally devastating. It would completely destroy my relationship with my son and possibly alienate me from my grandson forever. He needed to be sure I was prepared for this. I looked at Daniel and said something that surprised even myself. I said I no longer had a real relationship with Michael, not for years. I said the man who had stolen his own mother's inheritance wasn't the son I knew, wasn't the boy I'd raised. And as for Tyler, well, if I continued to accept that situation, what example would I be setting for him? That it's okay to steal, that it's okay to mistreat people, that it's okay to have no consequences for terrible actions? No. I needed to do this. Not just for myself, but for the memory of my mother who worked so hard to leave me that gift. She deserved me to fight for it. She deserved justice. Daniel immediately began working on the case. Over the next few days, he gathered all the evidence, prepared the necessary documents, and then sent an out-of-court notice to Michael and Jennifer. The notice stated that I had full knowledge of the inheritance my mother had left, that I knew they had misappropriated these assets, and that I demanded the immediate and full return of all amounts plus interest and monetary correction. The notice arrived at their home on a Thursday morning. Less than an hour later, my phone started ringing. It was Michael, and he was completely out of control. He was yelling at me over the phone, telling me I was crazy, that I didn't know what I was talking about, that there was no inheritance beyond the $5,000 he'd already given me. I asked him, maintaining a calm I didn't even know I possessed, how he explained the bank statements I had in my hands, how he explained the deed to the house in Wisconsin, how he explained the letters from my mother that I'd never received, but were all addressed to me. There was a tense silence on the other end of the line. Then I heard Jennifer's voice in the background. She was saying something to Michael that I couldn't quite understand. And then Jennifer took the phone from him. What happened next was one of the most unpleasant experiences of my life. Jennifer yelled at me with a fury I'd never seen from her before. She called me an ungrateful old woman, told me they'd been generous to me all these years, that I should be grateful they still let me be a part of their lives. She said that if my mother had truly wanted me to keep that money, she would have made it clearer that the fact she'd given Michael power of attorney showed she trusted him more than me. She said I was a manipulative, controlling mother who was trying to destroy their marriage out of pure envy and bitterness. Every word was poison, every accusation more absurd than the last. When she finally stopped screaming long enough to breathe, I said just one thing. I told her we'd see each other in court, and I hung up. My hands were shaking, my heart was pounding, but I also felt something new. I felt anger, yes, but I also felt power. I felt like I was finally taking control of the situation, that was no longer the passive victim who silently accepted everything. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a voice, that I had rights, that I had value. Over the next few days, Michael and Jennifer tried to contact me repeatedly. Calls, messages, emails. I ignored them all. Daniel had instructed me not to have any direct contact with them, that all communication should go through him from now on. A week after the initial notification, their lawyer contacted Daniel. He was a lawyer from a large Minneapolis firm, clearly expensive, clearly experienced. He proposed a settlement. Michael and Jennifer were willing to pay me $50,000 to settle the matter and for me to drop any legal action. $50,000 from an inheritance worth over $400,000. It was not only insulting, it was proof that they knew exactly what they had done and were trying to minimize the consequences. I rejected the agreement without hesitation. Daniel then prepared and filed a civil lawsuit seeking full restitution of all amounts, including monetary correction and accrued interest since my mother's death plus $100,000 in moral damages for the emotional distress they caused me. At the same time, he filed a criminal complaint with the public prosecutor's office for embezzlement and document forgery. The proceedings officially began. One of our first victories was obtaining a court injunction freezing all of Michael and Jennifer's bank accounts until the case was resolved. The judge understood there was a risk. They would dissipate their assets and hinder the enforcement of any eventual judgment in my favor. When the accounts were frozen, Michael and Jennifer panicked. I learned from mutual acquaintances that Jennifer had had a nervous breakdown when she discovered she couldn't access their money, that they had had to cancel an expensive trip to Europe they had planned, that they were struggling to pay their monthly bills because most of their cash was in the frozen accounts. I confess I felt a grim satisfaction upon learning this. Finally, they were experiencing some of the financial despair I had felt for years while they lived a life of luxury with my inheritance money. The process was long and complicated. We had several preliminary hearings where lawyers on both sides presented their arguments. Michael and Jennifer's lawyer tried to argue that my mother had given the assets to Michael as a gift during her lifetime, that the documents in my name were merely a formality she hadn't updated before her death. They presented several documents attempting to prove this, including supposed authorizations signed by my mother. But Daniel wasn't fooled. He hired a renowned handwriting expert to examine the signatures, and the expert categorically concluded that the extractors were forgeries clearly forged after my mother's death. The ink used wasn't even available on the market at the time the documents were supposedly signed. We also brought in several witnesses. The nurse who cared for my mother in the last months of her life testified that she constantly talked about how much she wanted to ensure I was well cared for and that she mentioned having everything organized specifically for me. The bank manager at my mother's bank account confirmed that she had opened the account with a significant balance, specifically in my name, and that she had never mentioned wanting to transfer it to Michael. Neighbors and friends of my mother testified about the close and loving relationship we had, refuting any suggestion that she would prefer to give everything to her grandson rather than her daughter. But the most devastating evidence came when we gained access to Jennifer's emails. During the discovery phase, Daniel petitioned the judge to have forensic experts examine Michael and Jennifer's computers and electronic devices, claiming they might contain relevant evidence. The judge granted it, and what they found was absolutely incriminating. There was an exchange of emails between Jennifer and a close friend of hers named Stephanie, dated approximately 6 months after my mother's death. In these emails, Jennifer described in painstaking detail how she had convinced Michael not to tell me about the royal inheritance, how she had researched legal ways to transfer the assets into their names, how excited she was at the prospect of using that money to finally live the luxurious life she had always dreamed of. In one of the most shocking emails, Jennifer wrote verbatim, "We're finally going to have the life we deserve. Old Margaret is so naive she'll never find out, and even if she does, who's going to believe her? Against her own son's word, we'll use the money to completely renovate the house, maybe. Buy that boat Michael always wanted, and finally, get rid of this boring job. And the best part is, I'll make Margaret keep helping me with Tyler, she's so desperate for attention that she'll keep coming whenever I call, completely unaware that we're swimming in her money. It's almost funny how pathetic she is." When I first read that email in Daniel's office during a trial preparation meeting, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. The sheer cruelty of those words, the utter contempt, the calculated malice. Jennifer hadn't just stolen my inheritance, she'd manipulated me, humiliated me, used me for years, all while laughing at me behind my back. And my son had allowed it all. He'd been complicit in it all. In that moment, any shred of doubt I might have had about doing the right thing completely vanished. These people needed to pay for what they did. Not for revenge, but for justice. For my mother's memory. For all the other victims who lacked the courage or resources to fight. The final trial took place on a cold March day almost 2 years after I retrieved that box from the lake. The courtroom was packed. Besides me, Daniel, and our legal assistants, there were Michael and Jennifer with their attorney, as well as several people from the community who had heard about the case and were curious to see the outcome. The judge was Richard Thompson, a man in his 60s, known for being fair but strict. For 3 full days, we listened to arguments from both sides, saw all the evidence presented, and heard witnesses questioned and cross-examined. Michael was visibly uncomfortable throughout the trial. He avoided looking at me, keeping his head down most of the time. Jennifer, on the other hand, tried to maintain an appearance of confidence, of offended indignation, but I saw the panic in her eyes every time new evidence was presented, especially when the emails were read aloud in court. I saw her pale, her hands begin to shake. She knew it was over. On the 3rd day after both sides had presented their closing arguments, Judge Thompson announced he would issue his ruling the following day. That night was one of the longest of my life. I could barely sleep, pacing from room to room in my house, mentally rehearsing every possibility. What if the judge ruled in their favor? What if he found there wasn't enough evidence? What if Michael and Jennifer walked free? But I tried to calm myself by remembering that Daniel had said we had an extremely strong case, that the evidence was overwhelming. I needed to trust the justice system. The next morning, I returned to the courtroom with Daniel. We sat in our seats and waited. When Judge Thompson entered and everyone stood, I felt my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. The judge sat down, adjusted his glasses, and began to read his ruling. He spoke for nearly 30 minutes, reviewing all the facts of the case, analyzing the evidence, explaining his legal reasoning. And then finally, he reached his conclusion. The judge ruled that it was irrefutably proven that Dorothy Patterson, my mother, had left a substantial inheritance specifically for me, her daughter Margaret. He determined that Michael and Jennifer Patterson had misappropriated these assets, using forged documents and abusing Michael's position of trust as the holder of power of attorney. He ordered them to immediately return to me the full sum of $420,000, the updated value of the inheritance with monetary correction and interest from the date of my mother's death. Furthermore, he ordered Michael and Jennifer to pay $100,000 in moral damages for the emotional distress, the manipulation, and the loss of the opportunity to learn my mother's last words through the intercepted letters. But that wasn't all. The judge also ordered the case referred to the public prosecutor's office for criminal proceedings for document forgery and embezzlement. Jennifer specifically was identified as the main orchestrator of the scheme based on evidence from emails and testimonies. She could face up to 3 years in prison if convicted. When the sentence was finalized, I simply broke down. I started crying right there in the courtroom, not tears of joy. Exactly, but tears of profound relief, of validation, of finally having the truth officially acknowledged. Daniel put his hand on my shoulder in a gesture of support, and I watched as several people in the audience began to applaud. The judge banged his gavel for order, but it was clear he was also satisfied that justice had been served. I looked across the courtroom to where Michael and Jennifer sat. Michael had his face in his hands, completely devastated. Jennifer was crying dramatically, as she always did when she wanted sympathy, but this time no one was falling for it. Their lawyer tried to console them, saying they would appeal the decision, but we both knew it would be futile. The evidence was overwhelming. The sentence was fair and unlikely to be overturned. In the 60 days following the judgment, the period set by the judge for them to make the payment, Michael and Jennifer had to make drastic changes in their lives. I later learned from mutual acquaintances that they had to put their house up for sale immediately. That beautiful 4-bedroom house in Edina, with a pool which had been renovated with my inheritance, was sold for well below market value, because they urgently needed the money. They also sold their 2 luxury cars, the speedboat Michael had bought the previous year and several pieces of jewelry and designer handbags Jennifer had collected. Even so, it wasn't enough. They had to take out a massive high-interest loan to cover the remaining debt. The life of luxury and appearances that Jennifer had so valued fell apart. They moved into a small 12-room apartment in a much more modest neighborhood. Jennifer had to go back to work, landing a job at a small advertising agency that paid far less than she was used to. Michael remained in his job, but his reputation was severely tarnished. News of the case spread, especially after the criminal proceedings began, and several clients of his firm became uncomfortable with continuing to be served by someone involved in family fraud. Eventually, he was fired. Jennifer's criminal case dragged on for several more months. In the end, she agreed to a plea deal with the prosecutor's office, pleading guilty to document forgery in exchange for a lighter sentence. She was sentenced to 2 years in semi-open prison plus 300 hours of community service and a fine. Michael, for cooperating with the investigation and showing genuine remorse, received only community service and a year of probation. As for me, I finally received the money that was legally mine. When I saw that $520,000 deposited in my bank account for the first time in years, I felt I could breathe easy. It wasn't about the money itself, although it was certainly a huge financial relief. It was about justice. It was about honoring my mother's memory. It was about proving I wasn't the pathetic, naive old woman Jennifer thought I was. I went to my mother's grave that day and spent hours, talking to her, crying, thanking her for everything she'd done for me, apologizing for not realizing what had happened sooner. With the money I made several changes in my life. First, I bought a new house. Not a mansion like Michael and Jennifer's, but a comfortable 3-room home in a quiet neighborhood with a beautiful garden where I could grow flowers and vegetables. I invested a good portion of the money in trust funds that would provide me with passive income for the rest of my life. I donated $20,000 to the local library in my mother's name, 'cause she loved to read and always valued education. I donated another $20,000 to the hospital where she spent her final days, specifically to the palliative care department. That treated her with such dignity and respect. And then for the first time in my life, I started doing things for pure self-gratification. I enrolled in painting classes at a local art school, something I'd always wanted to do but never had the time or resources for. I started traveling small trips at first, visiting nearby cities, exploring museums and parks I'd always wanted to visit. I started therapy with a wonderful psychologist named Susan, who helped me process all the trauma I'd experienced, who taught me about healthy boundaries, recognizing emotional manipulation, and valuing myself. Therapy was transformative. Susan made me understand that I had been a victim of emotional abuse for years, that I had normalized toxic behaviors in the name of maintaining family peace, that my need to be accepted and loved had made me vulnerable to manipulation, that I needed to learn to value myself regardless of the approval of others. It took months of hard work, of facing painful truths about myself and my relationship with Michael, but it was worth every second. About a year after the sentencing, I received a letter from Michael. It was a long handwritten letter where he finally admitted everything without excuses or justifications. He said he had been weak, that he had let Jennifer manipulate him, that greed and the desire for a comfortable life had blinded him to what was right. He said he was ashamed of what he had done, that he had betrayed not only me, but also the memory of his grandmother. He asked for forgiveness, not expecting me to truly forgive, but because he needed to express his regret. He ended by saying he had separated from Jennifer, that he was in therapy, that he was trying to become a better person, and that he hoped that perhaps someday in the distant future we could have some kind of relationship again. I read the letter over and over, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to believe he was sincerely sorry. After all, he was my son, the baby I had carried, raised, loved. But another part, the part that had matured through all that pain, knew that some mistakes are too big to simply forgive and forget. I showed the letter to Susan in therapy, and she helped me understand that forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation, that I could eventually forgive him on my own to free myself from the anger and pain, but that didn't mean I had to have him back in my life. I wrote a short, direct response. I acknowledged his regret and appreciated his honesty. I said that perhaps one day in the distant future, when the wounds were more healed, we could consider rebuilding some kind of relationship. But for now, I needed distance. I needed time. I needed to focus on my own healing. As for Tyler, my grandson, who is now 7, I said that when he was old enough to understand, I would like the opportunity to explain my version of events. But for now, I thought it best for him to stay away from that confusing and traumatic situation. Michael responded by saying he understood and respected my decision. And since then, we've maintained a respectful distance. He emails me occasionally brief updates on his life, photos of Tyler. I respond politely, but without elaborating. I don't know if I'll ever truly forgive him. I don't know if I'll ever have a real relationship with my grandson. But I've learned that it's okay not to know. That not every story has a perfectly resolved ending. That sometimes you have to accept ambiguity and incompleteness and move on anyway. Today, 3 years after that fateful day at the lake, I can say I'm doing well. Not just financially, although that certainly helps a lot, but emotionally and spiritually. I have a life that is genuinely mine, not defined by trying to please others or accepting crumbs of affection. I have true friends who value me for who I am. I have hobbies that bring me joy. I have independence and dignity. I still have that box I retrieved from the lake. I keep my mother's letters in a special drawer in my desk, reading them occasionally when I miss her. The photos have all been digitized and organized into beautiful albums, preserving those memories that were almost lost forever. The legal documents are kept in a safe, not because I think I'll need them again, but as a reminder. A reminder that the truth always finds a way to emerge, no matter how deeply someone tries to bury it. A reminder that you're never too old or too weak to fight for your rights. A reminder that dignity is worth more than any relationship based on lies. Sometimes when I walk around the lake, as I do almost every week now, I pass the exact spot where I saw Jennifer throw that box. And every time I pass by, I pause, take a deep breath, and silently give thanks. I give thanks for being in the right place at the right time. I give thanks for having the courage to retrieve that box. I give thanks for having the strength to fight when it would have been easier to remain ignorant. Because if I hadn't seen, if I hadn't acted, the truth would have remained buried. And I would have remained the pathetic, naive Margaret Jennifer thought I was. Life has a curious way of throwing opportunities our way. That day I went to the lake just to clear my head after yet another humiliation. I had no idea that walk would completely change the course of my life. I had no idea that a box thrown into the water held the answers to questions I didn't even know I needed to ask. But that's how it works sometimes. The truth appears in the most unexpected moments, and it's up to us to decide whether we'll have the courage to face it. Or continue living a comfortable lie. I could have left that box at the bottom of the lake. I could have pretended I didn't see anything. I could have continued being the submissive mother-in-law and grandmother who accepted any treatment, just to have some contact with my son and grandson. But I chose differently. I chose the truth, even knowing it would be painful. I chose justice, even knowing the personal cost. And I don't regret it for a second. If I could give one piece of advice to anyone going through something similar, it would be this: trust your instincts. If something feels off, if you feel like you're being manipulated or deceived, you probably are. Don't ignore these signs just because they come from people you love. Don't normalize emotional or financial abuse in the name of family harmony. Family is no excuse for mistreatment. True love doesn't require you to give up your dignity and rights. And most importantly, it's never too late to start over. When I discovered all that betrayal, I was 6'2". I might have thought I was too old to fight, to change my life, to start over. But I'm not. You're not. No one is. There's always time to reclaim your life, your dignity, your worth. There's always time to do the right thing, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Today, I live a simpler life in some ways, but infinitely richer in authenticity. I no longer have that constant pain of feeling rejected and undervalued. I no longer waste emotional energy trying to please people who will never truly value me. I no longer accept treatment that is less than I deserve. I've learned to set healthy boundaries. I've learned to value myself. I've learned that self-respect isn't selfish, it's a basic need. The story of the box in the lake has become something of a legend in my town. People stop me on the street every now and then to tell me they heard about the case and admire my courage. Some share their own stories of family betrayal, of abuse they suffered in silence for years. And whenever I hear these stories, whenever I see the pain in these people's eyes, I encourage them to seek justice, to not accept the unacceptable. Because silence doesn't bring peace, it only brings prolonged pain. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you for listening. I know it was long, I know it was painful in parts, but it was important to share all the details because situations like these are complex, not black and white. If you identify with any part of my experience, if you're going through something similar, please like this video to help me reach more people. I might need to hear this message. In the comments, tell me, have you ever faced family betrayal? How did you deal with it? Were you able to overcome it? Your stories can help others going through the same thing. Subscribe to the channel for more real stories like this. Stories of ordinary people who faced extraordinary situations. Stories that make you reflect, that move you, that teach you. Because we all have our battles, and sometimes knowing we're not alone makes all the difference in the world. And always remember, you deserve respect. You deserve dignity. You deserve to be valued. No matter what other people say or do, no matter how many times they try to make you feel small or insignificant, you have inherent value simply by existing. Never let anyone make you forget that. Never let anyone take away your dignity. And if someone tries, fight with everything you've got, because you are worth it. Your story is worth it. Your life is worth it. This was my story, the story of how a box thrown into a lake changed everything. The story of how I found strength where I thought there was only weakness. The story of how I regained not only my financial inheritance, but something far more valuable, my self-esteem and my dignity. And if I could do it, so can you. Don't give up on yourself. Don't give up fighting for what's right. Don't give up on your dignity, because in the end, that's what matters. Not how much money you have, not how many people surround you, but whether you can look in the mirror and respect the person you see there. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of this journey with me. And may my story in some way bring you strength and courage as you face your own battles. Until next time.